In January 2026, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom flew to Beijing. That alone wouldn't be unusual. World leaders make diplomatic visits all the time. Except this was the first visit by a British leader to China in 8 years. And it didn't happen alone. In less than 6 weeks, the leaders of the United Kingdom, Canada, and Finland, 3 of America's closest historical allies, lined up to meet with Xi Jinping. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz had a visit scheduled shortly after. Not one of them went to Washington first. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, walking out of his meeting with Xi, chose one specific word to describe China as a partner: predictable.
After your visit, is it fair to say that you're concluding that China is a more predictable and maybe reliable partner to Canada than the United States is today?
But yes, our relationship has progressed in recent months with China. It is more predictable.
America's closest neighbor was using that word not about Washington, about Beijing. That same week, Trump was threatening 25% tariffs on European goods unless Denmark handed over Greenland, calling Canada the 51st state, telling NATO he never needed them. The question is not whether the United States is losing allies to China. That answer is already written in the flight manifests of Starmer, Carney, and Macron heading to Beijing. The question is how we got here, and who, beyond Trump, is responsible. To understand what's happening in 2026, you have to go back to a decision made in 1972 and understand the logic behind it, because it's the same logic that drove every American president that followed. Nixon didn't go to Beijing out of idealism. He went out of cold calculation. Communist China, America's second greatest ideological enemy after the Soviet Union, could be used as a strategic counterweight against Moscow. The logic was elegant: split the two great communist powers, force them to distrust each other, and reduce pressure on Washington across both fronts simultaneously. The problem is that calculation only worked halfway. China was effectively separated from the Soviet Union, but the price paid for that, integrating Beijing into the international economic and technological system, produced consequences that American strategists either failed to anticipate or deliberately chose to ignore. In 1979, Jimmy Carter normalized diplomatic relations with Beijing and used America's dominant position within the World Bank to secure China's entry into the institution in 1980. The result? China received $9.95 billion in concessional loans through the bank's low-income lending arm alone, and an additional $39.8 billion in loans in the decades that followed, making it the second largest recipient in the institution's entire history. To put that in terms that actually land, $62 billion in World Bank loans to a single country is enough to completely rebuild every highway, bridge, power plant, and airport in the state of California twice. And that was just the beginning. In 1981, Reagan signed National Security Decision Directive Number 11, a document authorizing the sale to China of advanced aerial, naval, ground, and missile technology, not civilian technology. Military technology. 2 years later, Directive 76 opened the door to peaceful nuclear cooperation, feeding China's nuclear program with American expertise. By 1984, Reagan had visited Beijing personally and expanded export controls even further, this time to include anti-artillery radar systems, advanced torpedoes, and missile guidance technology. During this exact same period, Washington maintained an unofficial but universally applied rule: keep the Soviet Union 1 to 2 generations of technology behind. The United States in military capability. Declassified documents confirm this. Senior officials describe it as the foundational premise of Cold War technology policy, that restriction simply did not exist for China. The United States was actively blocking its primary adversary, a country in visible decline, from accessing advanced technology, while simultaneously handing that same technology to the world's second largest communist nation, which was rapidly ascending. In 1986, Reagan went further still. That year, the US government helped China establish research programs in genetic engineering, automation, biotechnology, laser technology, space technology, intelligent robotics, and supercomputing. That same same year, Washington engineered China's entry into the Asian Development Bank, which subsequently granted Beijing an additional $40 billion in loans for transportation, energy, agriculture, and infrastructure. To make the full scale of this clear, between 1980 and 1990, the United States and the international institutions Washington controlled injected more than $100 billion in capital, military technology, and cutting-edge scientific knowledge into a country that had shuttered its universities, sent its scientists to work on farms, and systematically dismantled its own technological base during the Cultural Revolution. In a single decade, the United States transformed a technologically devastated nation into the largest recipient of foreign investment in Asia, and they did it deliberately with signed directives and multilateral arrangements engineered in Washington, the country that sent 300,000 soldiers to kill Americans in Korea in 1950 was receiving American missile technology in 1983. Not because Washington had forgotten the Korean War, because the arithmetic of the Cold War made that investment seem justified, as long as the Soviet Union still existed. When the USSR collapsed in 1991, that justification disappeared. What American presidents did next wasn't recalibrate. It was find a new justification to continue down the same road. The single most consequential decision in the history of US-China relations, it was made by a president who believed, or needed to believe, in an unproven theory that free trade transforms authoritarian regimes into democracies. In 2000, Bill Clinton personally led the campaign to bring China into the World Trade Organization. The central argument was straightforward. WTO membership would force Beijing to adopt market reforms, open its economy, and respect international rules. In exchange, the United States would give up very little. And China, gradually integrated into the Western system, would inevitably democratize. Clinton made this promise explicitly. He said American companies would not be forced to relocate manufacturing to China or transfer valuable technology. He said China would have to open its markets to American goods in ways without precedent. He called it a good deal. China entered the WTO in 2001. What happened in the decade that followed made that promise impossible to defend. American imports from China nearly doubled in the first 5 years, from $51 billion to over $100 billion. But that number was just the opening act. By 2015, the accumulated U.S. trade deficit with China had surpassed $4 trillion. Entire cities across the Rust Belt, Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Youngstown, watched their factories' closest production shifted to Chinese workers who earned a fraction of an American wage. Economists called it the China shock. Subsequent studies estimated that competition from Chinese imports eliminated between 2 and 2.4 million American manufacturing jobs between 1999 and 2011. These weren't just job losses. These were communities that never recovered. Towns where the opioid crisis followed the plant closings like a second wave. China did not democratize. It used every dollar of Western investment to deepen its authoritarian system, expand its military, and build technological capacity. The money that was supposed to produce a middle class demanding political rights produced. Instead, the most sophisticated surveillance stayed in human history and the world's largest standing army. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo later acknowledged this publicly. Washington had encouraged China's WTO entry based on promises of market reformment, and no American president knew how to undo what had been done because the corporations profiting from Chinese manufacturing had far more influence in Washington than the factory workers in Ohio who had lost their jobs. George W. Bush came into office in 2001 calling China a strategic competitor. It was the hardest language any American president had used about Beijing since Nixon. It lasted exactly 6 months. After September 11th, Washington's singular obsession became Islamic terrorism. China was deprioritized, not because it had become less dangerous, but because there were other emergencies. Beijing, for its part, offered rhetorical support for the war on terror, signaled cooperation in international forums, and continued expanding its economy, its navy, and its missile program, while American attention was consumed by Iraq and Afghanistan. Barack Obama tried a different approach. In 2011, he announced the pivot to Asia, an explicit strategic reorientation, acknowledging that China represented the defining geopolitical challenge of the 21st century. The rhetoric was the most honest Washington had produced on the subject. The result of that 50-year pattern is measurable. In 1980, China accounted for less than 2% of the global economy. By 2016, when Trump was elected on a promise to reverse all of it, China was already the world's second largest economy, the largest global exporter, the largest manufacturing power in human history, and the holder of the world's second largest defense budget. What Washington built over 5 decades doesn't come apart with a trade war. Trump didn't inherit inherit a problem that could be fixed. He inherited the consequences of a bipartisan consensus that consistently chose short-term corporate profit over long-term strategic security. Donald Trump was the first American president in decades to explicitly name China as an existential threat to the United States, and treat that threat as a real policy priority, not just campaign rhetoric. His diagnosis of the problem was, broadly speaking, correct. 50 years of engagement had not democratized China. It had funded its rise. The problem is that correctly diagnosing a disease doesn't guarantee the prescribed treatment will work, and Trump's treatment produced a side effect that his strategists either failed to anticipate or refused to admit. The original strategy for containing China rested on a fundamental assumption that America's allies in Europe, the Pacific, and the Americas would form a unified front of pressure against Beijing. Without that front, the US would be alone against an economy already representing 17% of global GDP. Trump dismantled that assumption not by accident, but by conviction. His worldview is transactional. Alliances are contracts where each party pays its share, and any ally that doesn't pay proportionally is a parasite, not a partner. What that worldview misses is that geopolitical alliances don't function like commercial contracts. They function on credibility, the belief that the ally will show up when needed, regardless of the immediate cost. When Trump destroyed that credibility, he didn't just irritate allies. He eliminated the primary structural advantage the United States held over China. The numbers document the effect of that destruction with uncomfortable precision. A Gallup survey conducted across 31 NATO member countries throughout 2025 found that approval of American leadership had fallen 14 percentage points. In a single year, the largest recorded decline in the survey's history. Approval of Chinese leadership over the same period rose 8 points, its largest annual gain ever recorded. For the first time, China held slightly higher approval ratings than the United States within America's own military alliance. That is not just a popularity statistic, it is a direct measure of real geopolitical influence. When NATO members trust Beijing more than Washington, the alliance designed to contain China has, in practice, become neutral toward it. Greenland made this process visible in a way that cannot be undone. Trump resumed publicly pressuring Denmark to hand over Greenland, sovereign Danish territory, and Denmark is a founding NATO member. He threatened 25% tariffs on European goods if Denmark refused, said he wouldn't rule out military force. Beijing was watching and waiting, because what came next would prove, more explicitly than any geopolitical analysis could articulate, that Trump wasn't containing China. He was doing its work for it. On February 28, 2026, without consulting a single ally, the United States and Israel launched military strikes against Iran. What happened in the following 72 hours wasn't in the plan, or if it was, the plan ignored the single most predictable scenario, that Iran would respond by closing the Strait of Hormuz, the passage through which 20% of all the world's traded oil flows. Iran closed it. Oil prices rose 40% in 96 hours. The global economy began feeling the impact immediately. Trump called the allies, asked for warships to reopen the strait. The Germany responded through its government spokesman, "This is not our war. We didn't start it." The German defense minister was more specific. "I would like to remind everyone that the US and Israel did not consult us before this war, and that Washington explicitly stated at the outset that European assistance was neither necessary nor desired." France declared it would never participate in operations to open the strait in the current context. Spain refused outright. Italy declined. Japan said it had no plans to send warships. Australia ruled it out entirely. Then Trump did something that would have been unthinkable in any previous era of American foreign policy. He called China for help. Not an ally, not NATO. China, the country he had spent 2 years labeling America's primary adversary, whose leader he had called an enemy, against whom he had launched unprecedented trade wars and technology restrictions. China did not respond with an immediate refusal. It responded with calculated silence, the silence of a country that knows it has exactly what the other side needs and has no reason to hurry. What this moment reveals isn't just the fragility of America's position in the Strait of Hormuz. It reveals the logical conclusion of 50 years of American policy toward China. Nixon decided to use China as a tool against the Soviet Union. Reagan decided to arm China to contain Moscow. Clinton decided to integrate China into the WTO, hoping trade would democratize it. Bush and Obama decided to maintain engagement. Despite growing evidence, it wasn't working. Trump decided to confront China, but did so by destroying the alliances that would have made that confrontation possible.
I've never really asked anything of them. You know, they'll say they sent some troops to Afghanistan or this or that. And they did. They stayed a little back, a little off the front lines.
Why didn't you tell U.S. allies in Europe and Asia, like Japan, about the war before attacking Iran.
Because we wanted surprise. Who knows better about surprise than Japan? Okay? Why didn't you tell me about Pearl Harbor? Okay? Right?
The result is that in March 2026, the President of the United States is asking Beijing for help managing a crisis in the Middle East, while the leaders of his closest historical allies are standing in line in Beijing to sign trade agreements with Xi Jinping. China didn't win a war. It didn't need to. It waited for Washington to do the work. There is a dimension of this confrontation that rarely gets the precision it deserves. In certain specific geopolitical battlefields, China holds a structural advantage that the United States, by its own nature, can never replicate. And the economic war Trump chose as his primary instrument of confrontation happens to be exactly one of those battlefields. Xi Jinping doesn't govern by consensus, he governs by deliberate, documented centralization. In 2018, after eliminating the constitutional two-term presidential limit, Xi formally reorganized the party's economic decision-making apparatus, creating commissions directly subordinate to him that override the authority of dozens of ministries and agencies. Decisions that in Washington require months of negotiation between the executive, Congress, courts, and interest groups can be made in Beijing in a single meeting of the Politburo Standing Committee. 7 men, no electorate to answer, to no free press to question them, no institutional opposition to block them. That isn't just administrative efficiency. It's a concrete strategic advantage when the instrument of competition is high-speed, high-risk economic policy. In April 2025, Trump announced reciprocal tariffs against more than 180 countries simultaneously, the largest American tariff increase as a percentage of GDP since 1930. The stated logic was to force bilateral negotiations. What happened in practice was the opposite. The tariffs amounted to the largest tax increase on American households since 1993, equivalent to an average increase of $1,500 per household in 2026. American companies dependent on global supply chains began passing costs through immediately. Inflation climbed, markets dropped. China responded with surgical precision. Rather than immediately escalating to total confrontation, Beijing selected specific targets for maximum political impact: soybeans, poor corn, agricultural products from the Midwest, the states that elected Trump, the farmers who voted for Trump. China was sending a message directly to the American voters, most economically vulnerable to pressure, not to the government, but to the people keeping the government in power. At the same time, Beijing accelerated its strategy of expanding agreements with countries that suddenly found it much harder to do business with the United States, positioning itself as the stable alternative to a chaotic Washington. Meanwhile, Trump's own tariffs were being challenged in American courts. This is the structural problem that American economic policy has no easy answer for. In a democracy, a president cannot simply decide on an economic policy and sustain it indefinitely. It passes through courts, congressional review, interest group litigation, and electoral cycles that reshape Congress every 2 years. China watched each of these moves with the patience of a country that doesn't need to win quickly. It just needs to not lose while its opponent exhausts itself against its own institutional guardrails. But there is one additional layer to this tariff strategy that exposes perhaps the most fundamental miscalculation of Trump's entire approach. The theory behind tariffs assumes governments respond to their citizens, that when the economic cost of not negotiating with the United States becomes high enough, popular pressure forces leaders to yield. That logic works reasonably well when applied to mature democracies with active electorates and a free press. Applied to the real world, where the majority of countries Trump hit with the heaviest tariffs have political systems dominated by elites who face no meaningful popular accountability, that logic collapses entirely. Brazil is the most documented and most revealing case of this failure. In July 2025, Trump announced 50% tariffs on Brazilian goods, the highest rate imposed on any country in Latin America and among the highest in the world. The stated justification was not a trade deficit, it was not supply chain imbalance. The United States actually runs a trade surplus with Brazil, meaning America sells more to Brazil than it buys. By any purely economic logic, Brazil should not have been targeted at all. Trump chose Brazil specifically for domestic Brazilian political reasons, to pressure the Brazilian judiciary over the prosecution of Jair Bolsonaro and to attempt to tilt the October 2026 elections toward the opposition, which, theoretically, would be good, to install a government more aligned with American interests. And here is the structural problem Trump never calculated. The people who pay the cost of those tariffs are not the Lula government. They are the Brazilian coffee exporter, public opinion opinion surveys showed that the majority of Brazilians disapproved of Trump's actions and that the measures actually weakened support for Bolsonaro rather than strengthening it. The economic pressure did not produce the political reaction Washington expected. It produced the opposite. This is not surprising to anyone who understands how power actually functions in countries where political elites are insulated from the economic consequences they impose on their population. Brazil's response was not to capitulate to American demands. It was to diversify. The Brazilian government accelerated trade agreements with Japan, Indonesia, Vietnam, and India, and deepened its relationship with China, using American pressure as the internal justification for seeking alternative partners. Trump had created the perfect argument for Brasilia to do exactly what Washington said it was trying to prevent: pull Brazil even closer to Beijing. That pattern is not unique to Brazil. It reproduces itself across Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia, the regions where Trump concentrated his heaviest tariffs and where political power is most insulated from the economic consequences borne by ordinary people. In every one of those countries, the government's response was identical: don't negotiate under pressure. Find an alternative. And the alternative, with capital, infrastructure projects, and trade agreements ready to sign, was always the same: China. Xi's approach during this period is the precise counterpoint to Trump's. China's grand strategy is to build a geopolitical environment more favorable to its rise without provoking direct confrontation with the United States. Where Trump announces, Xi negotiates. Where Trump threatens, Xi offers. Where Trump demands, Xi lends. While Trump spent 2025 in tariff escalations that his own courts would ultimately strike down, China was signing trade agreements, expanding the Belt and Road Initiative, receiving Western leaders in Beijing, and consolidating its position as the power that, unlike Washington, you can actually plan around. Trump correctly recognizes that America's traditional Western allies are in relative decline. The problem is the conclusion he draws from that if allies are weaker, the US must take on more responsibility alone, and allies who don't pay their share deserve punishment. That's a logic that makes sense in a commercial contract. In a geopolitical alliance, it produces the opposite effect. It pushes weakened allies directly toward the one partner willing to offer investment without demanding immediate political alignment. The path to Chinese global leadership gets wider and more inviting the more the United States severs relationships and burns through its own credibility. China didn't need to convince any of these countries it was the better partner. Trump convinced them for it. The China that exists in 2026, its industrial capacity, its navy, its geopolitical influence, its position as an alternative to the American-led system was funded in substantial part by decisions made in Washington by presidents who believed they were containing it. When Canada's Prime Minister calls China more predictable than Washington, he is not paying Beijing a compliment. He is making a risk assessment. And when NATO members trust Chinese leadership more than American leadership, the containment strategy that depended on that alliance has become structurally impossible to execute. The Strait of Hormuz is blocked. The allies said no. And the American president is waiting for Beijing to pick up the phone. Is the war against Iran benefiting the United States? Or is it benefiting Israel and China?